All right. So I have two issues I wanted to discuss today. These have been open for a little bit, and I think we might have even discussed them a little bit, but I'm trying to make progress on them in Chromium. And after some more thought, I think it's a little bit more complicated than I realized. I wanted some input. The two issues are related to event timing attribution and exposing a target ID. We'll talk about that in a sec. And then when does event timing end, and what is the best way to expose that information? And we'll talk about that quickly. So here are the two issues. I also linked them in the notes. So issue 126, consider exposing event target ID. So the problem is that event timing is good for measurement, but that alone is insufficient. It is critical to have useful attribution. Event timing does try to report, the timestamp, the type of event, the full duration, that sort of thing. There's also an entry target, which was the original event target. However, target is a weak reference, and it may become null by the time event timing is actually reported to the performance timeline. So in your observer, you might find that there is no target, especially anytime that the page is dynamic or there's an SPA that has reconstructed the DOM as a result of the interaction, which is kind of like some of the more interesting situations where you need this information. So the suggestion is, could we serialize a representation of the target at the start of event dispatch? So if the target disappears, at least you'll have some reference, some representational reference. One simple thing to do is just to report the original tag name and ID of the element. Maybe there are specific attributes that help describe the context of that element. Maybe it's important if you're clicking on a link to have information about any anchored tags or like HLOP values that were nearby. Or maybe we could even do like full query selectors type thing. So is there any existing precedent in any existing APIs that we can lean on? Paint timing, previously element timing, thank you, Ian, does expose two different values. There is like an element, which is similar to target, where you can actually get a reference to the element if it's still there. But you also have identifier, which is a specific attribute, the element timing attribute, but also ID, like the ID of the element itself. So that is like, I think at a minimum, we could do ID. I think you could imagine possibly reporting element timing IDs, should they be there, or having an event timing ID, something like that. There's some folks have raised the option of, should developers be able to like opt in or hint or something like that. LOAF does some different types of attribution. I took a quick scan. I'm not sure how related they are. I don't think they overlap that highly, but I haven't audited all other specs. So that's kind of the question here. I will state some folks have been using a workaround. I think Gnome Helfman was the first to sort of share this with this group in the past. So because both event timing and event dispatch have the type and timestamp of the event, you could kind of keep your own map of metadata for events that you care to measure. And if you want to do something like query selectors as part of event dispatch before they're removed from DOM, you could save that yourself and you can reference it. So there is a workaround. I think for RUM products, this becomes a little bit more difficult to do performantly or to inject this type of observation at the right time. You kind of have to observe all listeners, and that this might not be a good thing. So that's the general problem. I think at a minimum, it would be quite easy to just add ID, but do we need more? That's the issue here. Looking for feedback as well as any experience. If anybody has something to point to of like, we could just do what this thing over here does, that'd be a nice result as well. So that was the first issue. This is a distinct issue. I'll just present them both together. Issue 129 is a bit more complicated. This is about how to measure event timing, especially when we have alternative endpoints. So the problem is that event timing measures from input to next paint, unless there is no related next paint. This is always how it's been. And sometimes we're learning increasingly that there are things that get in the way. There might have been a related next paint, but it might not be as related, or like the total end-to-end duration there isn't relevant. So like an example of this is visibility change. If you click a link and there's an anchor tag with a target of like new tab and you get a tab switch, the previous page might not have had a chance to do rendering work before the tab switch happened. And now rendering gets throttled for the background tab. So eventually when you switch back to that tab, there's your next paint. It's the first paint with the content of that interaction. But the fact that it took many seconds is irrelevant to the latency of this event. Page unloading, and a new one is JavaScript dialogues like alert, confirm, and print might block the page from doing rendering work, but there is some feedback provided. Nick, can I save it for the end, or do you want to inject to the recording? Okay, so the suggestion here is we already do things like this for element timing, where there might be a load time, there might be a render time, and we define a start time, we expose a start time in terms of like these primitive values. And therefore you could peek under the covers and say, well, in this case, there was no render time. That's why the LCP looks like the way it does. So could we, and I think we've discussed various forms of this, expose the actual type of time value that duration is based on? You know, there could be a render time, but there could be some alternative to render time. We can bike shed the name. And then we'll define the event timing duration in terms of those fundamental things. So you'll know, oh, actually, in this case, this event had no related paint. That's why it's short. So in the spec, today's behavior isn't really like explicitly spec how we do this fallback. We usually just say that the duration is relative to the next update the rendering opportunity, but you might not have a rendering opportunity and you might fall back and stuff like that. So I pointed out some stuff here, and I know, Noam, you made some changes to the spec in terms of rendering stages, and I haven't kind of audited to see if there's anything interesting that we can hook into there. But that's not such a big deal. I think it would be sufficient to have these timings and to know the duration and why it is defined the way it is. But I've heard requests from some folks to say, maybe we need to know the specific reason we're falling back to. Like maybe you need a visibility change time and a page unload time and a dialogue time, and like event timing would expose the specific name. Or maybe we would have like a reason value, like there'd be a render time or an alternative render time, but then you'd have a reason why we use this alternative render time. I don't personally think this is necessary, but I wanted to at least be transparent that some folks have asked. And I wanted to show a diagram of why this is important to differentiate. Like originally we thought it's sufficient to just use duration, and sometimes you get a smaller duration and that's fine. But this is kind of the flow of event timing today. You might have a JavaScript task that dispatches a few different events and that reports a few different event timing entries with different types, timestamps, and processing times. That is already what's happening. But we're attempting to add this in order to solve problems like what happens if you get an alert dialog in the middle of event dispatch. And it's open for a long time. The event feels long. We don't actually want it to be reported as long. So if we end duration right when the dialog is open, what ends up happening is you have a short duration event that then has processing work that follows later. All right, so like start time plus duration is supposed to be the end of the event timing, but now would actually end in the middle of the event timing. And we have processing start, we have processing end. There's a bunch of scripts that try to do attribution, that try to overlap with like loaf entries to do attribution. And I think it would break some scripts out there potentially. And so I think exposing the raw data, why these fallbacks were used, will become important. And it gets even more complicated when there are different other reasons. And if there's a visibility change event, we don't actually use the time that visibility changed. We just fall back to this end time here. So maybe that's too much information. I'll throw that up there. Hopefully the use case at least is clear and I can answer questions. So thank you for that.